aboard the dreadnought Void Tyrant, where entire planetary systems had been condemned by her decree, Empress Zalzireth sat upon her throne of obsidian and light. The war was over. The last human fleet had fallen, and the final survivors were rounded up like vermin. The galaxy had been cleansed of yet another resistance. She gazed out the vast viewport of her command chamber, watching as the once proud human capital Terra smoldered beneath the shadow of her fleet. Though they had fought with unparalleled ferocity, they had ultimately failed. Yet, there was something different about these creatures. They were insignificant by every logical measure, fragile, short-lived, primitive in their physiology compared to the vast array of species Zalzireth had subjugated. But they had resisted her for far longer than they should have. Even at the brink of annihilation, they had fought with reckless determination. She could not understand it. "Bring me a prisoner," she ordered, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. Moments later, a group of her elite guards entered, dragging in a shackled human. His uniform was torn, his face bruised, but his eyes burned with something unusual: defiance. "Lieutenant Daniel Carter of the UEC," the guard announced, shoving him onto his knees. Zalzireth regarded him coldly. "You will answer my questions, human. And if you value your insignificant existence, you will do so truthfully." The human grinned. "You're a lot shorter than I imagined," he said. A stunned silence filled the chamber. The guards stiffened, expecting their ruler's wrath. No one spoke to Zalzireth with anything less than absolute reverence or absolute fear. Yet, instead of incinerating him on the spot, she leaned forward, intrigued. "You jest in the face of death?" she asked, voice unreadable. Daniel shrugged. "Better than crying." She studied him, calculating. "Do you not fear me?" "Oh, I do," he admitted, stretching his sore limbs. "But fear's kinda boring. And besides, if I'm gonna be your prisoner, might as well get comfy, right?" For the first time in centuries, Empress Zalzireth felt something utterly foreign. Amusement. Perhaps humanity was worth studying after all. Inside the grand command chamber of the Void Tyrant, a silence stretched between Empress Zalzireth and Lieutenant Daniel Carter, one of the last surviving humans in her newly conquered dominion. He was shackled, bruised, and utterly at her mercy. And yet he smirked. The Empress of 1,000 conquered worlds, the architect of galactic submission, studied him with sharp, calculating eyes. For centuries, civilizations had shattered beneath the weight of her will, their leaders groveling at her feet in the desperate hope of survival. But this human? He sat as if he had just woken up in a bar after a long night of drinking, not as a prisoner before the most feared being in the known universe. Zalzireth spoke first. "You should be broken," she said, as if stating a scientific fact. "Your species is extinct in all but name. Your homeworld burns. Everything you have ever fought for is gone." She leaned forward slightly, her obsidian-black armor glinting under the cold glow of the chamber's artificial lighting. "And yet you jest." Daniel tilted his head. "Would you rather I weep?" She narrowed her eyes. "I would rather understand." He chuckled. "That's a first." Zalzireth frowned. "Explain." Daniel exhaled and adjusted his position, chains clinking. "Most conquerors I've read about don't give a damn about what their enemies think. They just take what they want. But you're curious." The Empress found his observation disturbingly accurate. "Curiosity is a tool," she replied, voice even. "It leads to understanding, which leads to control." Daniel smirked. "You say control, but I think it's more than that. If control was all you cared about, you wouldn't be here talking to me. You'd have tossed me out an airlock and been done with it." Silence. His words scratched at something deep within her, a notion she could not yet define. Zalzireth straightened. "Humans fought harder than they should have. Longer than they should have. Against all odds, you resisted, even when defeat was inevitable." "Why?" Daniel looked at her for a long moment, then shrugged. "Because we're stubborn." The answer irritated her. "That is not an explanation. That is an evasion." Daniel sighed. All right. You want to know why we kept fighting?" He met her gaze, eyes unwavering. Because humans don't just fight to win. We fight because we believe. Believe in what? In each other. In hope. In the chance that even if we don't survive, maybe, just maybe, our fight will inspire someone else to rise up. Zalzireth frowned. Hope. A foolish sentiment. A fragile thing that crumbled under the weight of reality. She had seen entire civilizations crushed because they clung to hope instead of recognizing the inevitable. And yet humans had held onto it even at the brink of extinction. Your people are gone, she said, watching his reaction. What hope remains for you? Daniel leaned back against the cold metal floor, staring up at the ceiling. Maybe none for me, but if there's even one human left out there, somewhere, if they're hiding in some deep space colony or a forgotten moon, then I want them to know that we didn't give up. That we didn't just roll over and let you win without a fight. Zalzireth remained silent, studying him. There was no deceit in his words, no calculated maneuvering. He spoke the truth as he saw it. And for the first time in centuries, she felt uncertain. A small sound, something between a scoff and a chuckle, escaped her lips before she could stop it. Daniel blinked. Did you just laugh? The guards in the room stiffened. Even they had never heard such a thing before. The Empress frowned. You are mistaken. Daniel's smirk widened. Nah, I heard it. That was definitely a laugh. Zalzireth narrowed her eyes. I have no use for laughter. Maybe not, he mused, but that doesn't mean you can't enjoy it. The words disturbed her in ways she could not explain. Enjoyment. What a useless concept. Conquerors did not need enjoyment. They needed power, strength, control. And yet, her golden eyes lingered on the human before her. This strange, infuriating anomaly of a species. Guards, she said finally. Leave us. The soldiers hesitated. One of them, a towering brute of an alien warrior, risked a glance at her. My Empress, it is not safe. Zalzireth turned her head slightly. The air in the room grew heavy. Did I stutter? The guards immediately saluted, then exited the chamber. Now it was just the two of them. Daniel sat up a little straighter, curiosity dancing in his eyes. All right, now I'm really interested. What's on your mind, Empress? Zalzireth steepled her fingers, watching him. Why had she dismissed the guards? A moment ago, this human had been just another prisoner. Curiosity, nothing more. But now, you amuse me, human, she admitted. Daniel grinned. Hey, I'll take that as a win. Zalzireth tilted her head slightly. You are not afraid of me. Not truly, he shrugged. I mean, I am, don't get me wrong. You could vaporize me with a thought. But I've been in hopeless situations before. I know that fear only has power if you let it. The Empress tapped a finger against her throne. That was an interesting thought. Fear only had power if one allowed it. Tell me, Daniel Carter, she mused, if our positions were reversed. If you sat upon this throne and I knelt before you in chains. What would you do? Daniel exhaled, considering. I'd probably start by offering you a drink. She blinked. What? He grinned. Nothing breaks the ice like a good drink. Then I'd ask you about your life, about what you want, about what makes you well, you. She stared at him, utterly perplexed. He would not seek vengeance? Not demand surrender? You are a strange creature, human, she murmured. Daniel smirked. You're not the first to tell me that. For the first time in her existence, Empress Zalzireth felt something other than power, other than conquest. She felt curiosity, and perhaps something deeper, something terrifying. The Void Tyrant drifted in high orbit above Terra's smoldering remains, its dark silhouette casting an oppressive shadow across the ruined world. The Empress sat on her throne, golden eyes locked onto the human before her. Lieutenant Daniel Carter was still shackled, still powerless before her overwhelming presence. And yet, he did not act like a man defeated. Empress Zalzireth had spoken to countless leaders, kings, and warlords before him. All had been reduced to fear or hatred by the time they stood before her. But not this human. No, he spoke to her as if they were equals. And that intrigued her. She broke the silence. You would offer me a drink, she mused. recalling his words from their last conversation. Even after I reduced your world to ash. Daniel exhaled. Yeah, well, what's done is done. Can't bring my people back. But I can at least try to understand the monster who killed them. She arched a brow. So you do think of me as a monster? He leaned forward, expression unreadable. You're asking as if you care. Zalzireth frowned. Care is a weak emotion. Daniel smirked. Then why does it bother you? She stiffened. Her mind, honed over centuries of conquest, sought an immediate refutation. But none came. The thought unsettled her. Shifting in her seat, she dismissed the notion and steered the conversation back to safer ground. Your species is unlike any I have conquered, she admitted. Others, when faced with inevitable defeat, submit, or they beg, or they die bitter, cursing my name. But humans? She studied him. Even now, you challenge me. Why? Daniel's smirk faded. Because that's who we are. Explain. He took a slow breath. You think power comes from fear, that people obey because they're terrified of you. They do, she said flatly. But that's not real power, he countered. You've got control, sure, but the second you show weakness, the second people think you're not as untouchable as they thought, they will turn on you. Zalzireth's gaze sharpened. You assume my empire is weak. Daniel shook his head. Not now. Not yet. But fear doesn't last forever. People get tired of being afraid. And when they do, they fight back. The words struck something within her. She had ruled for over 4 centuries. Countless worlds had fallen to her fleets, their populations forced into servitude under her iron rule. But, even now, rebellions brewed in the outer systems. Uprisings had to be crushed constantly. Every year, more factions rose against her. Her empire was vast, but it was never truly stable. Was Daniel right? Had she built an empire on a flawed foundation? No. She refused to believe that. The strong rule the weak, she declared. That is the way of the universe. Daniel sighed, shaking his head. Maybe that's how you see it. But humans? We don't work like that. She tilted her head. Then how do you work? He leaned forward. We fight for each other. We don't need to be the strongest to win. Hell, most of the time we aren't. But we have something that keeps us going. A reason to fight, even when we know we're doomed. Zalzireth studied him carefully. And what is that reason? Daniel gave her a small, tired smile. Hope. The word dug into her mind like a thorn. Hope. Such a fragile, useless sentiment. Hope did not stop planets from burning. Hope did not halt the advance of her war machine. Hope was the delusion of the weak. And yet, humans had fought her longer than any other species. Their armies had been vastly outmatched, their technology inferior, their fleets overwhelmed. They should have fallen in weeks, but they had resisted for years. Was it possible that hope had kept them standing when logic dictated their demise? She did not like this line of thought. Rising from her throne, she stepped down toward Daniel, towering over him. Even restrained, he did not flinch. That irritated her. You truly believe hope is stronger than fear? She challenged. Daniel held her gaze. I know it is. She searched his face for deception but found none. He meant it. Zalzireth turned away, pacing. This human's words conflicted with everything she had built her existence upon. Power, dominance, control. These were the tools that had made her the most feared being in the universe. And yet, she thought of her own empire, of her generals, who obeyed her not out of loyalty, but out of fear, of her subjects, who did not respect her, only dreaded her. Was she truly as powerful as she thought? A troubling silence stretched between them. Daniel watched her carefully, noticing the slight tension in her shoulders, the faint crease in her brow. I don't think you're as convinced as you pretend to be. She turned sharply. You presume too much, human. He gave her a small grin. Maybe. Or maybe you're starting to realize that fear can only get you so far. Zalzireth's hands curled into fists. The fact that she had not yet executed him was proof enough that his words had weight. She turned back to face him, her golden eyes cold yet uncertain. Rest, human, she ordered. We will speak again. Daniel exhaled but nodded. Looking forward to it, Empress. Zalzireth strode from the chamber, her mind a battlefield of conflicting thoughts. For centuries, the universe had trembled at her name. But now, for the first time in her existence, she wondered if it had ever truly respected it. And all because of a single human. The Void Tyrant hung in the void like a god of war, its massive silhouette blotting out the stars. Across its miles-long decks, officers and soldiers moved with mechanical efficiency, their purpose singular, to enforce the will of Empress Zalzireth. And yet, the Empress herself sat alone in her private chamber, staring into the holographic projection of her empire. Her dominions stretched across thousands of star systems, a vast network of conquered worlds, each bound to her rule through fear, an unshakable empire built on absolute control. But now, doubt gnawed at the edges of her mind. She had spoken to Lieutenant Daniel Carter for hours over the past days. The human was reckless, infuriatingly stubborn, and yet his words lingered. Fear doesn't last forever. People get tired of being afraid, and when they do, they fight back. She thought of the constant uprisings in the outer systems, of the generals who whispered behind closed doors, of the assassins she had personally executed over the years. Had her empire ever truly been stable? Her fists clenched. She should not be questioning herself. Doubt was weakness. Weakness was death. A chime interrupted her thoughts. Enter, she commanded. The doors slid open, revealing High Warlord Korthak, her most ruthless general. A towering reptilian warrior clad in ceremonial battle armor. He stepped forward and saluted with a fist to his chest. "My Empress," Korthak rumbled, his voice deep and gravelly. "I bring urgent news." She gestured for him to continue. Korthak hesitated for the briefest of moments, an action that did not go unnoticed. "There are whispers among the fleet," he admitted. "Dissatisfaction. Some of your commanders believe you have grown soft." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Zalzireth's golden eyes burned into him. "Do they?" Korthak lowered his gaze. The execution of the human prisoner would silence such doubts. For a long moment, she said nothing. Daniel Carter had done nothing but talk. He had not tried to escape, had not issued threats, had not begged for his life. And yet, his mere existence had shaken the foundations of her empire. Was it because he was right? Slowly, she rose from her throne. "And what do you believe, Korthak?" The warlord tensed. "I believe in strength, my Empress. If you have chosen a new path, I will follow. But many will not." A test. A challenge hidden behind words of loyalty. Zalzireth exhaled slowly. She had always ruled with an iron grip, never needing to explain herself. But now, even her most trusted warriors were questioning her. She could order Daniel's execution and crush any further dissent. But then she would be proving his point. Her empire, her power, was built on a fragile foundation. And deep down, she knew it. A sharp chime echoed through the chamber again. "Intrusion detected," an artificial voice announced. Korthak's eyes widened. "What?" Before anyone could react, the doors exploded inward. Betrayal. A group of armored soldiers stormed into the room, weapons raised. At their head stood Admiral Velker, one of her highest-ranking officers. His cold, cybernetic eyes locked onto the Empress. "My Empress," Velker said, voice dripping with mock reverence. "Your rule ends today." Zalzireth's expression did not change. She had expected this. "You would betray me, Velker?" The Admiral did not hesitate. "I would do what must be done. You have grown weak, Empress. Keeping the human alive? Entertaining his ideas? You are no longer the conqueror we once followed." Zalzireth's eyes flashed dangerously. "And so, you seek to replace me?" Velker raised his chin. "Yes." For a moment there was silence. The soldiers behind Velker shifted, ready to fire at a moment's notice. Then, Zalzireth moved. In a blur of motion, she seized the nearest soldier by the throat, crushing his windpipe with a single hand. His body hit the floor before the others could react. Korthak roared, drawing his massive blade and cutting through two rebels in a single stroke. Chaos erupted. Blaster fire tore through the chamber, striking against the dark walls. Zalzireth weaved through the storm of energy bolts, her form a blur of lethal precision. She disarmed, broke, and killed with the ruthless efficiency of a true warlord. Velker barely had time to raise his weapon before her hand found his throat. She lifted him off the ground, golden eyes burning. "You were a fool to challenge me," Velker gasped, struggling against her grip. "You are weak." Zalzireth tightened her hold. "I am still Empress." With a sharp twist, she ended him. The surviving traitors, seeing their leader fall, fled in terror. As the chamber fell silent, Korthak turned to her. He was bleeding, but his stance remained strong. "You have proven your strength," he said, wiping his blade. "The dissenters will scatter." Zalzireth exhaled, but there was no satisfaction in her victory. She had won, but only for now. The doubt, the cracks in her empire's foundation, remained. And for the first time in her reign, she wondered if she had been ruling the wrong way all along. A choice to be made. Zalzireth turned to Korthak. "Gather the fleet. Ensure that no more betrayals arise." The warlord nodded. "And the human?" She hesitated. Everything in her past told her to execute him, to end this distraction before it undermined her reign completely. And yet, he had been right. Fear had led to this moment. Fear had bred rebellion. Fear had nearly cost her everything. No, she would not kill him. She would listen. For the first time in her long reign, she would try something different. Her golden eyes burned with a new kind of determination. "I will speak with him," she said. Korthak's brow furrowed, but he did not question her. As she turned toward the prison chambers, Zalzireth felt something strange. Not fear, not anger, something dangerously close to hope. Deep within the Void Tyrant, in the cold silence of the detention block, Lieutenant Daniel Carter sat cross-legged on the floor of his cell. His wrists were still bound in energy cuffs, but the guards had long stopped treating him as just another prisoner. Perhaps it was because he was the last known human alive. Or maybe it was because their Empress had spoken with him more than once. Daniel glanced up as the reinforced door slid open. His smirk formed instinctively. She had returned. Empress Zalzireth entered, moving with the deliberate grace of a predator. But there was something different this time. She seemed unsettled. Daniel's smirk widened. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Zalzireth's golden eyes narrowed. "I have seen betrayal." Daniel leaned back against the cold wall. "Ah, I take it one of your own tried to stab you in the back." She did not answer immediately, but the silence was enough. Daniel exhaled. "Yeah, that's the thing about ruling by fear. Eventually, someone gets tired of being afraid." Zalzireth's jaw tightened. "Spare me your wisdom, human. I did not come here for your gloating." He studied her. Normally, she radiated dominance, like a force of nature carved into flesh and steel. But now she looked like someone questioning everything she had built. "All right," Daniel said, dropping the teasing tone. "Then why are you here?" Zalzireth stepped closer. The energy field of his cell cast a soft blue glow against her dark armor. "I have ruled for centuries," she said, voice controlled. "I have crushed empires, silenced rebellions, and burned worlds to cinders. I have known nothing but conquest." Daniel watched her carefully. "But now," she continued, "I have seen the flaw in my rule. I have seen what fear breeds. Weakness disguised as strength." She met his gaze. "And I despise it." Daniel tilted his head. "So what are you going to do about it?" The Empress was silent for a long moment. Then, she spoke words that would change everything. "I want to understand what makes you strong." Daniel's brow rose. "Come again." "I want to understand," she repeated, a fire burning in her golden eyes. "You said that fear is a fragile foundation, that people fight hardest when they have something to believe in." She stepped closer. "If that is true, then teach me, human. Teach me what makes your kind so defiant." Daniel let out a low whistle. "Wow, didn't have Empress of the Galactic Dominion asking for life advice on my bingo card." Her eyes narrowed. Do not mistake this for weakness. Daniel chuckled. Oh, trust me, I wouldn't be dumb enough to think that. You could still vaporize me in a heartbeat. Zalzirath did not deny it. A long silence stretched between them. Then Daniel sighed. All right, you really want to know? She nodded. He exhaled. Okay, first lesson. Hope isn't given. It's built. Zalzirath crossed her arms. Explain. Daniel leaned forward. You think of strength as a weapon, something you wield over others. But real strength, the kind that lasts, that comes from lifting others up, not crushing them. The Empress frowned. Lifting others up? That sounds inefficient. Daniel chuckled. That's because you've never tried it. Zalzirath considered this. For centuries she had ruled through power alone. But had she ever truly commanded loyalty? Or had she only demanded obedience? A dangerous thought. A thought that would have gotten her executed if she had spoken it aloud to her warlords. And yet it would not leave her mind. Daniel studied her expression. You're thinking about it, aren't you? Zalzirath scowled. You are insufferable. Yeah, he admitted. But I'm also right. Silence again. Then, to Daniel's complete shock, she deactivated the energy field. His eyes widened. Wait, what? Zalzirath stepped forward and unlocked his restraints. The energy cuffs fell to the floor with a metallic clink. Daniel flexed his wrists, staring up at her. You just let me go? The Empress's gaze remained intense. Not quite. Daniel tensed slightly. You are still my prisoner, she clarified. But now you are also my advisor. Daniel let out a slow breath. Ha! Didn't see that coming. Zalzirath's voice softened, just slightly. Neither did I. Daniel chuckled. All right, Empress. You want to learn how to build something stronger than fear. He extended a hand. Then let's get started. For the first time in her life, Zalzirath hesitated. And then, slowly, she took his hand. A handshake between a warlord and a prisoner. Between conqueror and conquered. Between fear and hope. Aboard the Void Tyrant, whispers spread like wildfire. The Empress had not executed the human. She had spoken with him repeatedly. And now he walked the halls of her warship, unshackled. Some called it madness, others treason. But none dared to challenge her. Not yet. Zalzirath sat upon her throne, watching as Daniel Carter studied a holographic projection of the Dominion's vast empire. His expression was unreadable, but she could sense the gears turning in his mind. A human mind so fragile and yet so infuriatingly resilient. So, she finally said, Tell me, human, if fear is not the way, how would you rule this empire? Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he zoomed in on a cluster of rebel systems flashing red. This is your problem, he muttered, pointing. You think fear keeps people in line, but what it really does is make them look for a way out. These uprisings? They're not just random acts of defiance. They're inevitable. Zalzirath frowned. And what would you do differently? Daniel turned to her. You want to keep your empire? You need to give them something to believe in. Right now, all they have is hate, fear, desperation. He met her gaze. Give them something else. The Empress narrowed her eyes. And what would that be? Daniel smirked. Hope. She exhaled slowly. You speak as though it is so simple. It's not, Daniel admitted. But you're starting to see the cracks, aren't you? Your empire is built on sand. You rule through force, but force only works as long as you're stronger than everyone else. And what happens when you're not? Zalzirath clenched her fists. That was what terrified her. For centuries, she had been unmatched. But for how much longer? She closed her eyes for a brief moment. And then she made her choice. When she spoke, her voice was steady, commanding, absolute. I will not watch my empire crumble. She stood, eyes burning with conviction. If I am to rule, it will be on a foundation that cannot break. Daniel grinned. That's the spirit. She turned to him, a small smirk playing at the edge of her lips. If I regret this, human, I will personally end you. Daniel shrugged. Wouldn't expect anything less, Empress. The rebellion's reckoning. The news spread across the Dominion faster than light. The Empress, the galaxy's most feared warlord, had met with a human. And she was changing. Some called it weakness. Others saw it as an opportunity. And so, on the far edges of the Empire, the fractured rebel factions gathered. Not to fight her, but to listen. Zalzirath stood before them, not as a conqueror, but as something new. Something terrifying in its own way. She did not ask for their surrender. She offered them something greater. A new dominion not ruled by fear, but by unity. Strength not through oppression, but through purpose. Many refused to believe her, but some listened. And that was all she needed. Because hope, once planted, spreads. The final defiance. But not everyone welcomed the change. Deep within the Dominion, a shadow gathered. High Warlord Korthak. Loyalty had bound him to the Empress for decades. But this was not the Empress he had sworn to serve. So he gathered the warlords who still believed in the old ways. The strong rule the weak. Fear is law. Mercy is treason. And he made his move. Zalzirath had known it would come to this. She had seen the betrayal in Korthak's eyes long before he acted. As his fleet arrived in high orbit above the Void Tyrant, she stood before her own forces, not as a tyrant, but as a leader who had made her choice. Daniel stood beside her. "You ready for this?" he asked. Zalzirath smirked. "I was ready the moment I met you." The battle that followed was legend. Korthak's forces fought with fury, but for the first time, Zalzirath's warriors fought for something greater than fear. They fought for their Empress. They fought because they chose to. And in the end, that made all the difference. Korthak fell. The last of the old warlords burned with him. And when the battle ended, the galaxy was forever changed. The universe trembles no more. It did not happen overnight. The Dominion did not become an empire of peace. Not entirely. But it became something greater than it was before. A new empire. A stronger empire. Built not on fear but on purpose. And at its head, Zalzirath ruled. The universe still spoke her name in hushed tones. But now it was not only with fear. It was with respect. And standing beside her always was the last human. The one who had taught her what power truly was. Epilogue. Zalzirath stood on the bridge of the Void Tyrant, gazing at the endless stars. Daniel approached, hands in his pockets. "So, Empress of the Galaxy, how's it feel to be feared and respected?" She glanced at him, smirking. "Tiring." Daniel chuckled. "Welcome to leadership." She was silent for a moment. Then, she said something that surprised even herself. "You were right." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "About?" Zalzirath exhaled. "Hope. It is not a weakness." Daniel grinned. "Took you long enough." She rolled her eyes but did not argue. Instead, she simply turned back to the stars, her stars. For the first time in centuries, she looked upon them not as conquests, but as possibilities. And the universe no longer trembled at her name. It watched, and waited, to see what the Empress and the last human would do next.